The stallion had already killed one man and maimed two others when Elara Kaine first laid eyes on him through the split-rail fence of the holding pen at the spring horse fair. And she knew immediately that no one had bothered to ask the animal what had driven him to such violence. The crowd around the paddock muttered and pointed, keeping a respectful distance from the massive bay horse that paced the far corner with his head high and his eyes showing white. And Elara could see the tension in every line of his body, the way he moved like something wild that had never been meant for a bridle. She set down the leather satchel that held everything she owned and stepped closer to the fence, her green fingers curling around the rough wood as she studied the horse with the same careful attention she would give to reading tracks in mud. "I would step back if I were you, miss." The voice came from her left, and Elara turned to see a human man in his middle 30s watching her with an expression that was not quite hostile but certainly wary. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the sun-weathered skin of someone who spent his days outdoors and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes were good quality but worn, the kind of practical garments a man wore when he had money once but was watching it slip away. "That horse is a killer. Put down a stable hand 3 weeks ago, crushed his chest against the wall. The man did not live to see morning." Elara looked back at the stallion who had stopped pacing to stare at her with those wild eyes. What did the stable hand do to him? The man blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What did he do? He was doing his job, feeding the damned animal. And before that, Elara pressed. What happened before the horse killed him? A muscle worked in the man's jaw, and for a moment Elara thought he would not answer. Then he said, in a voice that was carefully controlled, "The horse belonged to my brother. My brother died 6 months ago, thrown from a different mount entirely. Since then, this one has been unrideable, vicious. We have tried everything." "You have tried whips and spurs and force," Elara said quietly. It was not a question. The man's eyes narrowed. "We have tried what works on horses." "On horses that have not lost someone," Elara corrected. She did not look away from the stallion, who had taken a step closer to her side of the pen, his nostrils flaring as he tested her scent on the spring wind. "Horses grieve too. This one is angry because he hurts and no one has acknowledged it." "That is ridiculous," the man said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "You are saying the horse is in mourning. I am saying that horses bond with their riders, and when that bond is severed suddenly, they do not understand why." Elara turned to face the man fully, meeting his eyes despite the way his gaze skipped over her tusks and the deep green of her skin before settling somewhere near her shoulder. Most humans could not hold eye contact with an orc for long. "Your brother must have been a good rider, patient. The horse loved him. And now he is gone, and everyone who has come near since has treated the horse like a monster instead of a creature in pain." The man was silent for a long moment, and Elara could see something shifting behind his eyes, some old wound being prodded that he did not want to acknowledge. Finally, he said, "I am Kieran Ingram. That horse is called Tempest, and in 2 days, I am going to have him put down because I cannot afford to feed an animal that cannot be worked, and I cannot in good conscience sell him to someone else only to have him kill again. If you think you can do something with him, you are welcome to try, but I will not be held responsible when he breaks your bones." Elara nodded once, already moving toward the gate of the pen. "I am Elara Kaine, and I will need you to send everyone else away. Horses can feel crowds and they respond to the fear. Right now, every person standing here is expecting violence, and that expectation is making him more dangerous." Kieran Ingram looked at her as though she had grown a second head, but after a moment he turned and raised his voice to the onlookers. "Fair is over here, folks. Move along." When several people hesitated, Clearly hoping for the spectacle of watching an orc woman get trampled, his voice turned sharp. "I said move. Now." The authority in his tone did what Elara's request could not, and the crowd dispersed, though she could feel their curious glances as they drifted toward other pens and exhibitions. When the last of them had gone, Elara turned to Kieran and said, "You too. Wait by the far fence." "Like hell," Kieran said flatly. "If that horse attacks, you will need someone to pull you out. If you stay, he will see you as a threat and he will attack to defend himself," Elara said, keeping her voice level and reasonable. "You look like your brother, I am guessing. Same height, same build. To Tempest, you are a ghost wearing the wrong face and it confuses him. It makes him angry. So unless you want a guarantee that I get hurt, you will wait over there and let me work." Kieran's expression went very still, and Elara realized she had struck closer to the truth than she had intended. After a long moment, he turned and walked to the far fence without another word, his shoulders rigid with tension. Elara waited until he was well away before she unlatched the gate and stepped into the pen, closing it carefully behind her. Tempest was watching her now with his full attention, his ears pinned flat against his skull, and his weight shifting as though preparing to charge. Elara did not look directly at him. Instead, she moved slowly to the center of the pen, and then sat down on the ground, folding her legs beneath her and resting her hands loosely in her lap. It was a position of absolute vulnerability, and she could hear Kieran swear quietly from his place at the fence, but she kept her gaze lowered and her breathing steady. The horse snorted, a sharp explosive sound that made the fence rails creak as he shifted his weight. Elara did not move. She began to speak, her voice low and rhythmic, not quite singing but close to it. She spoke in the orcish tongue first, words her grandmother had taught her about patience and pain and the long, slow work of healing, and then she switched to the common language so that the horse might recognize the cadence if not the meaning. "You are angry," she said softly. "You are angry and you are frightened, and you do not understand why he left you. You think perhaps you did something wrong, that you were not fast enough or strong enough. And now you are alone, and everyone who comes near you smells like fear and expects you to be a monster. So you have become what they expect, because it is easier than being confused and sad." Tempest tossed his head, but his ears had swiveled forward, just slightly. Elara continued speaking, letting the words flow over the horse like water, steady and soothing and utterly without demand. She told him about the long roads she had traveled as a drover, about the cattle and horses she had gentled, about the way grief could sit in the chest like a stone until someone acknowledged it. She did not know if the horse understood the words, but she knew he could hear the tone, the lack of threat in her voice. The sun moved a hand's width across the sky. Elara's legs began to ache from sitting, but she did not move. Tempest paced the perimeter of the pen, always keeping her in sight, and gradually the pacing slowed. His ears were fully forward now, and the white had disappeared from his eyes. Elara kept speaking, her voice hoarse now from the long monologue, and finally, the horse stopped pacing altogether and stood looking at her from 10 feet away. "I know you miss him," Elara said, and for the first time she looked directly at Tempest, meeting his dark eyes. "I know it hurts. But he would not want you to be like this. He would want you to run and work and be what you were meant to be, and I think if you let me I can help you remember how." Tempest took one step toward her, then another. Elara remained perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest but her face calm. The horse came closer, stretching his neck out to sniff at her hair, her shoulder, her hands. His breath was hot and grassy, and when he lipped at her fingers she felt the softness of his muzzle against her palm. Very slowly, she raised her hand and touched his nose, just the lightest brush of her fingertips. Tempest did not pull away. Elara heard Kieran's sharp intake of breath from the fence, but she kept her focus on the horse. "Good," she murmured. "That is good. You are a good boy, Tempest. You are not a monster. You are just hurting, and that is all right. We can work with hurting." She stayed there, sitting on the ground with Tempest standing over her, for another hour before she finally rose, moving slowly so as not to startle him. The horse followed her to the gate, and when she slipped out and latched it behind her, he pressed his nose against the rails as though asking her not to leave. Elara stroked his forehead through the fence and promised, "I will be back tomorrow." Kieran was waiting for her by the far fence, his expression unreadable. When Elara walked over to him, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, rough as gravel, "Stay here with me." Elara blinked. "What? Stay here?" Kieran repeated. He was not looking at her now but at the horse, who was still standing by the gate watching them. "The fair moves on tomorrow for market day in the next county. But I have a ranch 5 miles north of here, and I have 24 horses that need breaking and gentling because I cannot get workers to stay when Tempest is in the barn. If you can do with the others what you just did with him, I will pay you drovers' wages and room and board. You can stay in the hired hand's cabin. It has a good stove and a decent bed." Elara hesitated. She had been traveling with the fair for 3 years, ever since her own family's farm had been burned by raiders who thought orcs made easy targets. The constant movement had suited her, the way each town was new and each job temporary, never staying long enough for the suspicion in people's eyes to turn into something worse. But she was tired, bone tired, of sleeping on the ground and eating camp food and always being the outsider. "I would need to work with Tempest every day," she said slowly. "Not just the others. He is going to take time." "I understand that," Kieran said, "and I am not asking you to perform miracles, but if you can make him safe enough that I do not have to destroy him, that would be." He stopped, his jaw working as though the words were difficult to force out. "That would mean something." Elara looked back at the pen where Tempest still waited, his ears pricked toward her. Then she looked at Kieran Ingram, at the grief written in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders, and she thought about what it might be like to stay in one place for a while, to have a project that mattered, to perhaps be useful to someone. "All right," she said. "I will stay." The ranch was called Ingram's Rest, and it sat in a valley between 2 low hills where a creek ran year-round, and the grass grew thick enough to support a sizable herd. The house was a sturdy 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a barn that was large enough for 30 horses comfortably. The hired hand's cabin that Kieran showed Elara to was a single room with whitewashed walls and a stone fireplace, but it was clean and dry, and the bed had a real mattress stuffed with straw and wool. After 3 years of sleeping on the ground, it looked like luxury. "There is a well between here and the main house," Kieran said, standing in the doorway as though unsure whether he was welcome to enter. "Help yourself to water whenever you need it. Meals are at dawn, noon, and dusk, and you are welcome to eat in the kitchen. My housekeeper is named Margaret, and she does not bite, though she has opinions about most things. If you need anything else, come find me. I am usually in the barn or the north pasture this time of year." Elara set her satchel on the bed and turned to face him. "When can I start with the horses?" "Tempest arrives tomorrow morning," Kieran said. "I am having him brought up from the fair grounds. The others are already here. There are 12 2-year-olds that need their first real handling, 8 3-year-olds that are saddle broke but still green, and 4 older mounts that have developed bad habits. I will introduce you to them after you have settled in." I would rather meet them now, Elara said. Before I have time to be nervous about it. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Kieran's face, gone so quickly Elara almost missed it. All right then. Come on. The barn was dim and cool after the brightness of the spring afternoon, and it smelled of hay and horses and leather. Kieran led her down the central aisle, naming each horse as they passed. This is Dancer. She is gentle as a lamb but refuses to take a bit without a fight. Next to her is Storm Cloud. He is fine under saddle but will not load into a wagon for love or money. The bay mare at the end is Rosie, and she has decided that rearing is an appropriate response to being asked to canter. Elara stopped at each stall, letting the horses sniff her hands and speaking to them in the same low, soothing voice she had used with Tempest. Some of them were curious, nosing at her pockets in search of treats. Others were wary, keeping to the backs of their stalls and watching her with suspicious eyes. She made mental notes about each one, cataloging their body language and the way they responded to her presence. "You are good with them," Kieran said when they had reached the end of the aisle. It was not quite a question, but there was something tentative in his voice, as though he was still not entirely sure what he had agreed to by bringing her here. "I like horses," Elara said simply. "They are honest. If they do not like something, they tell you. They do not smile and lie and then drive you off your land in the middle of the night." Kieran looked at her sharply. "Is that what happened to you?" Elara shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the personal turn the conversation had taken. "It is not important. I am here now, and you have horses that need work. That is what matters." For a moment she thought Kieran would push the subject, but instead he just nodded and gestured back toward the barn doors. "Margaret will have supper ready in about an hour. I will see you then." He left her there in the barn, and Elara spent the remaining daylight walking the property, learning the layout of the pastures and the fences and the small training ring behind the barn where she would do most of her work. The land was beautiful, rolling and green with new growth, and she could see why Kieran fought to keep it. But she could also see the signs of struggle, fences that needed mending, a roof on the equipment shed that was starting to sag, fields that should have been planted already but still lay fallow. Whatever money troubles had driven Kieran to keep Tempest in the fair holding pen rather than in his own barn were ongoing, and Elara suspected they were worse than he had let on. Supper was a quiet affair. Margaret turned out to be around, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and a forthright manner that Elara appreciated. She served roast chicken and potatoes and greens from the kitchen garden, and if she was surprised to find an orc woman sitting at her table, she hid it well. Kieran ate mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, and excused himself as soon as the meal was finished. "Do not take it personally," Margaret said as she cleared the plates. "He has been like that since his brother died." Tobias was the talker of the two, always telling stories and making people laugh. Kieran keeps things inside. "What happened to Tobias?" Elara asked, helping to stack the dishes despite Margaret's protests. Margaret's face softened with old grief. "Riding accident. His horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. Tobias broke his neck in the fall. It was quick, at least. He did not suffer." She paused, her hands stilling on the dish cloth. The two of them were close. Kieran raised Tobias after their parents died, even though there were only 5 years between them. Tobias was 15 and Kieran was 20, and Kieran could have sent him to live with their aunt in the city, but he kept him here instead. Taught him everything about running the ranch. And then Tobias went and died, and it has been eating at Kieran ever since. Elara thought about Kieran's face when she had suggested that Tempest was grieving, the way his expression had shuddered so completely. He blames himself. Of course he does, Margaret said. Tobias was riding the fence line that day because Kieran had asked him to check for breaks after the spring storms. If Kieran had gone himself, or if he had sent one of the hands, Tobias would still be alive. That is how Kieran sees it anyway. No amount of telling him otherwise makes a difference. Elara finished drying the last plate and set it carefully on the shelf. Grief is like that. It does not respond to logic. Margaret looked at her with something like approval. You are wiser than your years, girl. How old are you anyway? 24, Elara said. Old enough to know that pain is stubborn and healing takes time. Well, Margaret said, if you can help that boy let go of even a little bit of what he is carrying, you will be worth twice what he is paying you. Now get on to bed. Morning comes early on a ranch. Tempest arrived the next day in a reinforced wagon with high sides, and a driver who looked deeply relieved to be rid of his cargo. Kieran and Elara watched as the horse was unloaded into a large paddock that had been specially prepared, with sturdy fencing and no sharp corners where he might injure himself. Tempest immediately galloped the perimeter, his tail flagged and his head high, and Elara felt a pang of sympathy for the animal. He had been cooped up too long, treated like a prisoner rather than a living creature with needs and feelings. I will start working with him this afternoon, Elara told Kieran. Right now he needs to run off his frustration. Let him settle for a few hours. Kieran nodded, his eyes never leaving the horse. I have not seen him move like that in months. He looks almost like himself again. He was magnificent once, Elara guessed. He was Tobias's pride and joy, Kieran said quietly. Tobias trained him from a colt, spent hours every day working with him. Tempest would follow him around like a dog, and Tobias used to joke that the horse was smarter than half the hired hands. His voice caught slightly on the last words, and he cleared his throat roughly. Anyway, I have work to do. Let me know if you need anything. He walked away before Elara could respond, and she watched him go with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Kieran Ingram was a hard man to read, all walls and careful control, but she was beginning to understand that the walls were not there to keep people out so much as to keep his own grief contained. If she could help him break down even a few of those barriers, perhaps they could both start to heal. She spent the morning working with the younger horses, using the same patient methods she had employed with Tempest. Most of them were eager to please, just confused about what was being asked of them, and Elara found that a gentle hand and a clear, consistent approach worked wonders. By noon she had Dancer taking a bit without fuss and Storm Cloud standing calmly while she opened and closed the wagon gate beside him. After a quick lunch, she returned to Tempest's paddock. The stallion had stopped his frantic pacing and was grazing in the center of the enclosure, but his head came up immediately when he saw her approaching. Elara climbed over the fence and dropped into the paddock, then sat down in the same spot she had used at the fair. Tempest watched her for a long moment, then slowly walked over and lowered his head to sniff at her hair. "Hello again," Elara said softly. "I told you I would come back. Are you ready to work today?" She spent the next hour simply sitting with the horse, letting him grow accustomed to her presence and her scent. Then, very gradually, she began to touch him, running her hands over his neck and shoulders and back, feeling for tension and old injuries. Tempest stood mostly still for the handling, though his skin twitched occasionally and his ears swiveled to track every sound. When Elara's fingers found a knot of muscle at the base of his neck, the horse grunted and leaned into the pressure, and she smiled. "You are full of aches, are you not?" she murmured, working the knot with her thumbs. "No one has touched you kindly in a long time. That is going to change now." By the time the sun was lowering toward the horizon, Tempest was following Elara around the paddock like an oversized dog, And when she left for supper, he stood at the fence and nickered as though asking her to stay. Elara promised to return in the morning and walked back to the main house, feeling more hopeful than she had in months. Over the following weeks, Elara settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She worked with Tempest every day, slowly building his trust and teaching him to accept a halter and lead rope again. The stallion was intelligent and responsive once he understood that Elara was not going to hurt him, and his progress was steady. The other horses came along well too, and Elara found that she had a knack for understanding what each individual animal needed. Dancer stopped fighting the bit entirely once Elara realized the mare had a sensitive mouth and switched to a gentler style of bridle. Storm Cloud's fear of the wagon turned out to be rooted in a bad experience with a driver who had whipped him. And with patience and positive reinforcement, Elara had him loading and unloading calmly within 2 weeks. Kieran watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read, but Elara noticed that he spent more and more time near the paddocks where she worked, finding excuses to mend fences or move hay bales within earshot. Sometimes he would lean against the rails and watch for an hour at a time, saying nothing, and Elara grew used to his silent presence, the way she had grown used to the hawk that circled overhead each afternoon, or the barn cats that followed her hoping for mice. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Kieran approached her as she was brushing Tempest down after a particularly good session. The stallion had worn a saddle for the first time that day, and though he had been tense at first, he had settled once he realized the saddle did not hurt him. It was a major milestone, and Elara was feeling justifiably proud. "That was well done," Kieran said, surprising her. He rarely commented on her work directly. "He is ready," Elara said, running the brush over Tempest's flank in long, soothing strokes. "Not to be ridden yet, but ready to remember that tack is not a punishment. Another few weeks, and I think he will accept a rider." Kieran was silent for a moment, and when Elara glanced over at him, she was surprised to see something raw and vulnerable in his face. "I never thought I would see him wearing a saddle again. I thought he was lost." "He was never lost," Elara said gently. "He was just waiting for someone to meet him where he was instead of trying to force him to be something he was not ready for." Kieran looked at her then, really looked at her, and Elara felt something shift in the air between them. "You could be talking about more than just the horse." "I could be," Elara agreed. She set down the brush and turned to face him fully. "Grief makes us behave in ways that do not make sense to other people. Sometimes it makes us dangerous. But that does not mean we are broken beyond repair. It just means we need someone patient enough to sit with us in the pain until we are ready to move forward." Kieran's throat worked as he swallowed. "You lost someone too. Your family, from what you said." "My father and my 2 younger brothers," Elara confirmed. "Raiders came in the night and set fire to our house. My mother and I were out checking the livestock and we saw the flames. By the time we got back, it was too late. My mother died a year later from a fever, but I think she was really dying of a broken heart. She just did not want to be here without them." "I am sorry," Kieran said, and the words were inadequate but clearly sincere. Elara shrugged, a gesture she had perfected over the years to hide the ache that never really went away. "It was a long time ago. I have learned to carry it. Does it get easier?" The question was so quiet Elara almost missed it. "No," she said honestly, "but you get stronger. And eventually you find reasons to keep going that have nothing to do with the person you lost. You build a new life around the hole they left, and after a while the hole does not define everything anymore. It is just part of the landscape." Kieran nodded slowly, and Elara could see him absorbing her words, testing them against his own experience. After a long moment he said, "Thank you. For this. For all of it. I know I am not easy to work for. You are not difficult, Elara corrected. You are just hurting. There is a difference. He gave her a look that was almost a smile, and for the first time since she had met him, Elara saw a hint of the man he must have been before grief carved away all the soft edges. Margaret thinks you are a saint for putting up with me. Margaret has opinions about everything, Elara said, echoing Kieran's words from her first day, and was rewarded with an actual smile, brief but genuine. That she does, Kieran agreed. He hesitated, as though debating whether to say something more, then seemed to decide against it. I should let you finish up here. Good work today, Elara, truly. He walked away, and Elara turned back to Tempest, who had been standing patiently through the entire conversation. I think we are making progress, she told the horse. Both of us. The turning point came on a hot afternoon in late spring when a stranger rode into the ranch yard on a flashy chestnut gelding and asked to speak with Kieran Ingram about purchasing a horse. Elara was in the training ring with Rosie, working on the mare's tendency to rear, when she saw Kieran emerge from the barn to greet the visitor. The stranger was well dressed, with expensive boots and a coat that looked like it had been tailored in a city, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. Elara could not hear the conversation from where she stood, but she saw the stranger gesture toward Tempest's paddock and saw Kieran's face close down like a door slamming shut. After a few minutes, the two men walked over to the paddock together, and Elara dismounted from Rosie and tied the mare to the fence so she could drift closer and listen. As I said, Mr. Ingram, I am prepared to offer top dollar for that stallion, the stranger was saying. His voice was smooth and cultured, with the accent of someone from the eastern cities. I have been looking for a horse of his quality for my breeding program, and from what I have heard, he is a once-in-a-generation animal. I am willing to pay $3,000, cash, right now. That is twice what he would bring at auction, even in his current condition. Kieran's face was like stone. Tempest is not for sale. Mr. Ingram, please be reasonable, the stranger said, his tone taking on a cajoling quality. I understand you have an emotional attachment to the animal, but from what I hear, your ranch is in financial difficulty. $3,000 would go a long way toward solving your problems, and the horse would have an excellent home with me. I have a state-of-the-art facility with experienced trainers, and I said he is not for sale, Kieran repeated, and there was an edge to his voice now that made Elara tense. Thank you for your interest, but you are wasting your time here. The stranger's expression hardened. I see. And how exactly do you plan to keep this ranch afloat, Mr. Ingram? From what I understand, you are 3 months behind on your loan payments and the bank is getting impatient. Pride is all well and good, but it does not pay the bills. That is none of your concern, Kieran said flatly. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do. Feel free to see yourself out. He turned and walked away, his stride stiff with barely controlled anger, and the stranger watched him go with an expression of mingled frustration and calculation. Then he turned and looked directly at Elara, who had been standing near enough to overhear the entire exchange. His eyes traveled over her green skin and tusks with the kind of dismissive disdain that made Elara's teeth clench. You work here? He asked, his tone making it clear that he found the idea surprising if not outright offensive. I do, Elara said shortly. Then perhaps you can talk some sense into your employer, the stranger said. That horse is wasted here. He should be producing foals, building a legacy. Instead, he is rotting in a paddock on a failing ranch because Ingram is too sentimental to see reason. It is tragic, really. Elara took a slow breath, reminding herself that punching the stranger would not help anyone. Tempest is exactly where he needs to be. And Kieran Ingram is the best man I know. His ranch is not failing, it is recovering. There is a difference." The stranger laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Recovering. Is that what you call it when the bank is threatening foreclosure? Ingram's Rest will be on the auction block by fall, and that stallion with it. Mark my words. If your employer had any business sense at all, he would sell while he still has the chance to get a decent price." He mounted his gelding and rode out without another word, leaving Elara standing by the paddock feeling sick with worry. She had not known the financial situation was quite that dire. Kieran had never said anything specific, just made vague references to times being tight, and Elara had assumed it was the normal feast or famine existence of a rancher. But if the bank was truly threatening foreclosure, then the stranger's offer might have been the only thing standing between Kieran and losing everything. She found Kieran in the barn, mucking out stalls with a vicious energy that spoke of barely contained fury. He did not look up when she approached, just kept shoveling soiled straw into the wheelbarrow with sharp, jerky movements. "I heard what that man offered," Elara said quietly. "Is it true? Is the bank really threatening to take the ranch?" Kieran's hands tightened on the shovel handle. "It is not your concern. It is if I am working here," Elara countered. "Kieran, $3,000 is a lot of money. If it would save the ranch, I am not selling Tempest," Kieran interrupted, and the raw pain in his voice stopped Elara mid-sentence. "I could not save Tobias. I could not keep my brother alive. But I can keep his horse safe, and I will not sell him off to some city breeder who sees him as nothing but a stud fee. I will not do it, Elara. I would rather lose the ranch." Elara stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time just how deeply the guilt ran. Kieran had not been able to protect Tobias, and now he was pouring all of that helpless grief into protecting the one thing his brother had loved most. It was not rational, but grief rarely was, and Elara understood the impulse better than most. "There has to be another way," she said. "Kieran, you have 24 horses here that are getting better every day. The younger ones are ready to be sold as trained mounts, and the older ones are worth twice what they were a month ago now that their bad habits are fixed. If we sold them, would that be enough?" Kieran finally looked up at her, and the hope and desperation warring in his face made Elara's chest ache. "I owe the bank $4,000 in back payments. Even if we sold every horse on this property except Tempest, we might get close, but it would leave the ranch with no breeding stock and no income for next year. I would be trading one disaster for another." Elara thought hard, turning the problem over in her mind. What if we did not sell all of them? What if we kept the breeding mares and the youngest colts, the ones that are not ready yet, and sold only the ones I have been working with? The fully trained ones will bring premium prices, especially if we take them to the summer fair in 2 months. Buyers pay top dollar for a horse that is already green, broke, and steady. Kieran was shaking his head before she finished. "Even at premium prices, we are talking maybe 1,500, 2,000 at best. It is not enough." "Not on its own," Elara agreed. "But what if we also offered my services as a trainer? We could take commissions, promise to gentle and break problem horses for other ranchers. I could train here during the week and travel on weekends to work with horses that are too difficult to transport. It would be a steady income stream, and if we build a reputation, it could grow over time." Kieran was staring at her now, and Elara could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the desperate hope starting to take root. That could work. It would take time to build the clientele, but the Hendersons 3 valleys over have a mare that bucks like a demon. And I know for a fact that old Samuel Whitmore has been trying to sell a cart horse that will not pull for over a year now. If you could fix those two, word would spread fast. "Then that is what we will do," Elara said firmly. "We will sell the trained horses at the fair and we will start taking commissions. Between the two, we should be able to make up the difference. It will be tight, but it is better than losing everything." Kieran set down the shovel and crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. Before Elara quite knew what was happening, he had pulled her into a hug, his arms coming around her in a grip that was almost desperate. "Thank you," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "Thank you, Elara. I do not know what I did to deserve your help, but thank you." Elara stood very still, surprised by the sudden contact but not uncomfortable with it. Kieran was warm and solid against her, and she could feel the tension thrumming through him like a plucked string. Slowly, she raised her arms and hugged him back, offering what comfort she could. "You gave me a place to stay when I needed one," she said quietly. "You trusted me with your horses and your grief. That is more than most humans have ever done. Of course I am going to help you." Kieran pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands still resting on her shoulders. His eyes were suspiciously bright, and Elara realized with a jolt that he was on the verge of tears. "I am not good at this," he said roughly. "At asking for help, at letting people in. But you have been patient with me, and I want you to know that I see it. I see what you have done here, and it is not just the horses. You have given me something to hope for again, and I did not think that was possible." "You would have found it eventually," Elara said. "You are stronger than you think." "Maybe," Kieran said, "but it would have taken a hell of a lot longer without you." He hesitated, and Elara saw something shift in his expression, some decision being made. "Elara, if we can pull this off, if we can save the ranch, I want you to stay. Not just as a hired hand, as a partner. We could build something here together, a real training operation. You have the skill and I have the land and the contacts. We could make this work long-term." Elara's breath caught. "Kieran, I am an orc. People are not going to want to do business with—" "I do not care what people want," Kieran said fiercely. "You are the best horse trainer I have ever seen, and you are the only person who has been able to help Tempest. If people have a problem with your ears or your skin, they can take their business elsewhere. I am not going to let ignorance and prejudice cost me the chance to work with someone as talented as you." Elara felt something hot and tight in her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of something deeper. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that," Kieran confirmed. He was still holding her shoulders and his gaze was steady and sincere. "Stay, Elara, please. Not just because I need your help with the horses. Stay because I want you here. Because I think, if we are honest about it, we are both better when we are together." Elara knew in that moment that she was in serious danger of falling in love with Kieran Ingram, if she had not already done so without realizing it. He was stubborn and grieving and far too hard on himself, but he was also kind and honorable and willing to fight for what mattered to him. And somehow, impossibly, she had become one of the things that mattered. "All right," she said, and the smile that broke across Kieran's face was worth every moment of uncertainty. "I will stay. We will save your ranch and we will build something good here, together." Kieran pulled her into another hug, and this time Elara did not hesitate to wrap her arms around him and hold on tight. They stood there in the barn, surrounded by the warm smell of horses and hay, and for the first time in a long time, Elara felt like she had found a place where she truly belonged. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of activity. Elara worked from dawn until well past dusk, training horses and traveling to neighboring ranches to assess problem animals. Word of her skills spread quickly, and soon she had more commissions than she could reasonably handle. Kieran worked alongside her, managing the business side of things and helping with the younger horses that did not require her specialized touch. They fell into an easy rhythm, learning each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. and the ranch began to feel less like a place of grief and more like a place of possibility. Tempest continued to make steady progress, and on a warm morning in early summer, Elara finally deemed him ready to be ridden. Kieran had been avoiding the paddock that day, finding excuses to work in the far pasture, and Elara knew he was nervous about what would happen when someone finally climbed into the saddle. She did not push him, just went about her work methodically, fitting Tempest with the tack he had grown accustomed to, and talking to him in the low, soothing voice he had learned to trust. When everything was ready, Elara led Tempest to the center of the paddock and stood beside him, one hand on his neck. "This is going to feel strange at first," she told the horse, "but I promise it will not hurt. You know me and you trust me, and I am asking you to let me do this. Can you do that for me, Tempest?" The stallion snorted softly and lipped at her shoulder, and Elara took that as assent. Moving slowly and deliberately, she put one foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up, swinging her leg over Tempest's back and settling gently into the saddle. The horse tensed immediately, his muscles bunching beneath her, and for a moment Elara thought he might bolt or buck. But then she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his mane and murmuring reassurance, and gradually Tempest relaxed. "Good boy," Elara said, sitting up slowly and gathering the reins. "That is my good, brave boy. Now we are just going to walk. Nice and easy, no pressure, just you and me." She nudged Tempest forward with her heels, and after a moment of hesitation, the stallion took a step, then another. Elara kept her hands light on the reins and her weight balanced, letting Tempest set the pace, and soon they were walking a slow circle around the paddock. It was not graceful, and Tempest spooked twice at shadows, but he did not buck or rear or try to throw her, and by the time Elara finally dismounted, she was grinning so hard her face hurt. She turned to lead Tempest back to the gate and stopped short. Kieran was standing by the fence, and his face was wet with tears. He did not try to hide them or wipe them away, just stood there watching as Elara brought the horse over. "He let you ride him," Kieran said, his voice thick. "He actually let you ride him." "He did," Elara confirmed. She opened the gate and led Tempest through, then handed the reins to Kieran. "He is ready, not for long rides or hard work yet, but ready to remember what it is like to have a rider. And Kieran, I think he is ready for you. I think, if you talk to him the way I do, if you are patient and gentle, he will let you ride him too." Kieran looked down at the reins in his hands as though he had been handed something precious and fragile. "I do not know if I can. What if I do something wrong? What if I remind him too much of Tobias and it sets him back?" "You will not," Elara said firmly. "Tempest knows the difference between you and your brother. He is not confused anymore, and he is not angry. He is just a horse who has been through something terrible and is learning to trust again. Just like you. And I think, maybe, you need to ride him as much as he needs to be ridden. You need to prove to yourself that you can have this connection with something that Tobias loved without it hurting." Kieran looked at her for a long moment, and Elara could see the fear and hope warring in his expression. Finally, he nodded. "Will you stay while I try?" "Of course," Elara said. "I will be right here." Kieran led Tempest back into the paddock and spent several minutes just standing with the horse, running his hands over Tempest's neck and speaking to him in a low voice that Elara could not quite hear. Then, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that spoke of deep fear being pushed aside, he put his foot in the stirrup and swung himself up into the saddle. Tempest stood rock still, his ears swiveling back to listen to Kieran, and for a long, breathless moment, neither horse nor rider moved. Then Kieran leaned forward and wrapped his arms around Tempest's neck, just as Elara had done, and Elara saw his shoulders shake with silent sobs. Tempest turned his head and nuzzled Kieran's leg, a gesture so gentle and deliberate that it brought tears to Elara's own eyes, and she knew the horse understood exactly what was happening. When Kieran finally sat up, his face was composed, though his eyes were still red. He gathered the reins and nudged Tempest forward, and the stallion responded immediately, walking a calm, steady circle around the paddock. Kieran's posture was good, his hands light, and as Elara watched, she saw some of the tension that had been locked in his shoulders for months begin to ease. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes, Kieran and Tempest moving together with increasing confidence, and when Kieran finally dismounted and came over to where Elara stood, there was something different in his face. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing she saw when she looked at him. There was peace now, too, and a kind of quiet joy. "Thank you," Kieran said, and this time the words were not desperate or raw. They were simply grateful, a recognition of what Elara had given him, for all of this, for seeing what I could not see, for not giving up on either of us. "You did the work," Elara said, "both of you. I just pointed you in the right direction." Kieran reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in a gesture that was achingly intimate. "I think we both know it was more than that. You saved us, Elara. You saved me, and you saved Tempest, and you saved this whole damned ranch. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Elara said. "That is not how this works. We are partners, remember? We are building something together. That is payment enough." "Partners," Kieran echoed, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was thinking of a different kind of partnership, something more than just business. But he did not push, just squeezed her hand gently and then let go. "Come on. Let's get Tempest settled and then go tell Margaret the good news. She's going to want to make something special for supper." The summer fair was held in a town 2 days' ride south, and Kieran and Elara set out with a string of 12 horses, all of them trained to saddle and ready for sale. It was a long, dusty journey, but the weather held and the horses traveled well, and by the time they arrived at the fairgrounds, Elara was cautiously optimistic about their chances. The fair was a chaotic sprawl of pens and stalls and exhibition rings, with buyers and sellers from 3 counties crowding the aisles and haggling over livestock. Kieran secured a good spot near the main ring and set about arranging their horses to best advantage, while Elara walked the grounds to get a sense of the competition. There were some fine animals on display, but none that had been trained with the kind of care and attention that she had given to their string. And by the time the first buyers started coming around, Elara was confident they would do well. She was right. By noon on the first day, they had sold 3 horses at premium prices, and by the end of the second day, the entire string was gone. The buyers were universally impressed with the quality of the training, and several of them asked for Elara's name and how they might commission her services in the future. Kieran handled the negotiations with a skill that surprised Elara, driving hard bargains and refusing to be lowballed. And when they finally tallied up the proceeds, they had earned just over $1,800. "It is not quite enough," Kieran said that night as they sat by the small fire outside their rented stall. "But with the commission money we have already earned, and the deposits people have put down for future work, we are close. Very close. If we can pick up a few more jobs in the next month, we should be able to make the bank payment on time." "We will," Elara said confidently. "People are talking about what we did here. The word is spreading. We are going to be all right, Kieran." Kieran looked at her across the fire, and the expression on his face made Elara's heart skip a beat. "I could not have done this without you. Any of it. I want you to know that. You are not just my partner in business, Elara. You are my partner in everything." And I think, if I am being honest, I have been falling in love with you since the day you sat down in Tempest's pen and talked him out of being a killer." Lara's breath caught. She had known, on some level, that her feelings for Kieran had grown beyond simple friendship or professional respect. But hearing him say the words out loud, hearing the sincerity and the vulnerability in his voice, made it real in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I am an orc," she said, because it was the first thing that came to mind, and because it was the objection everyone would raise. "People are not going to accept us. They are going to make our lives difficult." "Let them," Kieran said fiercely. "I do not care what people think. I care about you. I care about the way you see the world, the way you see me. I care about the fact that you are brave and kind and smarter than anyone I have ever met. And I care about the way I feel when I am with you, which is more alive than I have felt in years. If people cannot accept that, then they do not deserve our time or our energy." Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back impatiently. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that," Kieran said. He stood and circled the fire, then knelt beside her and took both her hands in his. "I love you, Elara Kaine. I love your strength and your compassion and the way you fixed something in me that I did not even know was broken. And I am asking you, right here and right now, to give me the chance to love you the way you deserve to be loved. Not as a hired hand or a partner, but as the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. Will you do that? Will you give me that chance?" Elara looked at him, at the hope and fear mingled in his eyes, and she thought about everything they had built together over the past months. She thought about the ranch that was starting to thrive again, the horses they had saved, the trust they had earned from each other. And she thought about how much she wanted this, wanted him, wanted the life they could build together if they were brave enough to reach for it. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steady and sure despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Kieran, I love you too. I think I have loved you since you asked me to stay that first day, since you looked at me and saw someone worth trusting instead of just another orc to be feared. So yes, I will give you that chance. I will give us that chance." Kieran's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, bright and warming and full of promise. He leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as Elara responded, her hands coming up to cup his face and pull him closer. It was a kiss that tasted like hope and healing, like the beginning of something precious and hard-won, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "We should probably get some sleep," Kieran said eventually, though he made no move to let go of her. "We have a long ride home tomorrow." "Home," Elara echoed, and the word felt right in her mouth in a way it had not for years. "Yes, let's go home." They made it back to Ingram's Rest with 3 days to spare before the bank payment was due, and with the money from the fair and the deposits from new commissions. They had enough to cover the debt with a small cushion left over. Kieran made the payment in person, walking into the bank with his head high and a check for the full amount, and the relief on his face when he returned was palpable. "We did it," he said, catching Elara up in a spinning hug that left her breathless and laughing. "We actually did it. The ranch is safe." Margaret insisted on making a celebration dinner, and that evening the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table eating roast beef and fresh bread, and toasting their success with glasses of wine that Margaret had been saving for a special occasion. The housekeeper had taken the news of Kieran and Elara's relationship with equanimity, simply nodding and saying, "About time. I was beginning to think you two were blind," and Elara felt a rush of affection for the practical, no-nonsense woman who had welcomed her without hesitation. As the summer turned to autumn, life on the ranch settled into a new normal. Elara continued to train horses, and word of her skills spread far enough that they began receiving commissions from ranchers as far as 3 counties away. Kieran managed the business and worked the land, and together they built the kind of partnership that was rooted in mutual respect and deep affection. Tempest thrived under their care, and Kieran rode him regularly now, the two of them moving together with an ease that spoke of trust rebuilt and grief slowly transforming into acceptance. The prejudice that Elara had feared did materialize, but not in the overwhelming way she had expected. There were a few ranchers who refused to work with them because of her orcish heritage, and there were occasional muttered comments in town when they went for supplies. But for the most part, people were too impressed with the results to care much about the color of Elara's skin. And when someone did make a pointed remark, Kieran shut them down with a cold efficiency that left no room for argument. He had meant what he said about not tolerating ignorance, and he proved it again and again. As the leaves turned and the first frost touched the ground, Kieran proposed properly, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and a speech that was halting and earnest and utterly sincere. Elara said yes without hesitation, and they were married in a small ceremony at the ranch with Margaret and a handful of neighbors in attendance. It was not a grand affair, but it was full of warmth and genuine joy, and when Kieran kissed his bride under the arbor they had built together, Elara felt a sense of rightness that went bone deep. They spent the winter making plans for the future, talking late into the night about expanding the training operation and maybe, eventually, starting a family. Elara had never allowed herself to think much about children, had assumed that her life would be one of solitude and wandering, but with Kieran, the idea did not seem so impossible. They had built something good together, something worth protecting and nurturing, and the thought of adding to it, of creating a family that was rooted in love and respect rather than fear and prejudice, was both terrifying and thrilling. Spring came early the following year, and with it came the annual roundup, a week-long effort to gather the horses from the far pastures and check them over before the breeding season began. It was hard, exhausting work, but Elara loved it, loved the feeling of being part of something larger than herself, loved the way she and Kieran moved together as a team, anticipating each other's needs and covering each other's backs. On the last day of the roundup, as the sun was setting and the last of the horses were being settled into the near pastures, Kieran rode up beside Elara on Tempest. The stallion was magnificent in the golden light, his coat gleaming and his ears pricked forward with interest, and Kieran sat him with the easy confidence of a man who had finally made peace with his past. "I have been thinking," Kieran said as they rode slowly back toward the barn, "about what comes next, about the future." "And what have you been thinking?" Elara asked, glancing over at him with a smile. "I have been thinking that we should breed Tempest this year," Kieran said. "There are a dozen mares that would be good matches for him, and his bloodline is too valuable to waste. Tobias would have wanted that, I think. He would have wanted Tempest's legacy to continue." Elara felt a surge of pride and affection for the man beside her. It had taken Kieran a long time to reach the point where he could think about Tempest as something other than a living memorial to his brother. And the fact that he was ready now to let the horse move forward into a new chapter was a testament to how far he had come. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said. "And I think Tobias would be proud of you, for everything. For keeping the ranch, for saving Tempest, for building a life that honors his memory without being defined by it." Kieran reached over and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their fingers laced together. When they reached the barn, they dismounted and worked together to settle the horses for the night, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of long practice. And when the last stall was closed and the last lantern extinguished, they walked hand in hand back to the house, where Margaret had supper waiting and the fire was burning warm in the hearth. As they ate, Kieran told Margaret about his plan to breed Tempest, and the housekeeper nodded approvingly. "It is about time that horse had something to do besides eat his weight in hay," she said. "And there are worse legacies than a line of fine colts." "I want to name the first colt after Tobias," Kieran said quietly, "if that is all right. I think it would be a good way to remember him, to have his name live on in something new and hopeful." Margaret's eyes grew bright, and she reached across the table to squeeze Kieran's hand. "He would like that very much. You are a good man, Kieran Ingram." "Your brother always said so, and he was right." They finished supper in companionable silence, and as the evening wore on and the conversation turned to lighter topics, Elara felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She had come to this place broken and grieving, looking for nothing more than a temporary refuge, and she had found a home. More than that, she had found a family, people who accepted her not despite her differences but because of them, people who saw her for who she was and valued her accordingly. When the night grew late and Margaret retired to her own quarters, Kieran and Elara climbed the stairs to the bedroom they now shared. They undressed slowly, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment, and when they finally slipped into bed together, Kieran pulled Elara close and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I love you," he said softly. "I love the life we have built and the future we are creating. And I am grateful every single day that you walked into that paddock and decided to stay." "I love you too," Elara whispered back. "And I am grateful that you asked me to, that you saw something in me worth keeping." "You were always worth keeping," Kieran said. "I just had the good sense to recognize it." They fell asleep, tangled together, and in the morning they woke to the sound of horses nickering in the barn and the smell of Margaret's coffee drifting up from the kitchen. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way except for the quiet, steady happiness that suffused every moment. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the rhythm of ranch life continued. Tempest sired his first foal, a strong-legged colt with his father's intelligence and spirit, and Kieran named him Tobias as he had promised. The training business continued to thrive, and Elara's reputation grew until they were turning away commissions because they simply did not have time to take on any more work. They hired a young man to help with the day-to-day labor, a quiet, hard-working fellow who did not seem to care that his employers were an interspecies couple, and with the extra help, the ranch flourished. In the second year of their marriage, Elara discovered she was pregnant. The news was both joyful and terrifying, because neither of them knew what to expect from a child with human and orc blood. But their doctor assured them that such children were rare but not unheard of, and that there was no reason to expect complications. Elara's pregnancy was smooth and uneventful, and on a cold winter morning, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green-tinted skin and pointed ears. They named him Davian, and he was perfect. Kieran held his son with the kind of fierce, protective love that brought tears to Elara's eyes, and as she watched her husband cradle their child, she felt a sense of completeness that she had never imagined possible. They had built a life together out of grief and hope and stubborn determination, and now they had a family to show for it. Margaret doted on the baby shamelessly, declaring him the most beautiful child she had ever seen and spending hours rocking him and singing old lullabies that she claimed her own grandmother had taught her. And Tempest, who had watched the entire process of Elara's pregnancy with apparent interest, seemed to understand that the small, noisy creature was important, and would stand calmly by the fence when Elara brought Davian out to see the horses. As Davian grew from infant to toddler, he proved to have his mother's affinity for animals and his father's steady temperament. He was walking by 10 months and riding his first pony by 2 years, and by the time he was 3, he was helping Kieran with the morning feeding and following Elara around the training ring with a child's intense curiosity. The prejudice that Elara had worried about never materialized in any significant way, perhaps because the community had grown used to seeing her and Kieran together. Or perhaps because Davian was so clearly a happy, loved child that even the most hardened bigot found it difficult to muster much outrage. Years passed, and the ranch continued to prosper. They expanded the operation, adding more pastures and a second barn, and their reputation as horse trainers spread far enough that buyers came from neighboring territories to purchase their stock. Tempest grew old with grace and dignity, siring a line of fine colts and fillies that carried his bloodline forward, and when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 23, Kieran mourned him properly, with tears but also with gratitude for the years they had been given. They buried Tempest on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple marker that read, "Beloved companion and loyal friend." And on the day of the burial, as Kieran stood with his arm around Elara and Davian stood between them holding both their hands, Kieran said quietly, "Tobias would have been proud of him, proud of all of this. We did right by him, I think." "You did right by him," Elara corrected gently. "You honored his memory by building something good and lasting. That is all anyone can ask." Kieran nodded, and they stood there together on the hill as the sun set over the valley, a family forged in the crucible of grief and love. And as Elara looked out over the land they had fought so hard to keep, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the young orc woman who had walked into a paddock to tame a killer horse and ended up finding a home. It had not been easy, and there had been moments when she had doubted whether it was worth the struggle. But standing here now, with Kieran's arm around her and their son holding her hand and the ranch spread out below them like a promise, she knew without question that every moment of pain and fear and uncertainty had been worth it. She had found a place where she belonged, people who loved her, and a future that was bright with possibility. And that, she thought, was more than most people ever got. That was everything.